second speaker today is Matthew Schulte, and Matthew, I know has taken several philosophy courses. His paper is on human imperfection and divine intervention on Homer's Odyssey. Matthew is currently a sophomore at Roosevelt, but was a freshman when he wrote this paper. He's a sociology major, but I'm going to be trying to convince him as best I can that he needs to be at least a double major in sociology and philosophy. But Matthew, Alena has written a very good paper. Matthew.
Good morning. For better or for worse, I have been placed under the rule of Warnerian and Minkovian philosophy, and I feel it's certainly reflected in my paper here. So I'll let you all take it as you will.
And blame them for
This is your fault. In countless cases throughout the Odyssey, humans lay blame for the misfortunes they endure on the gods. However, in most, if not all cases, blame falls with humans themselves for making selfish and impious choices that anger the gods. In some instances, humans knowingly defy the gods and challenge their metaphysical authority. But the gods themselves are not wholly without blame, some choosing to side with and aid humans that other gods despise. This creates an intricate web of justified and unjustified blame between multiple humans and gods alike. The complex nature of conflict throughout the story is first seen in the start of the poem, where Athena learns of and displays scorn for the suitors when meeting with Telemachus, son of Odysseus. However, Odysseus' delayed homecoming is, at first, by no invention of his own, but rather is the work of Poseidon, who is furious with Odysseus for blinding his son, Polyphemus the Cyclops. Some blame for the discontent between humans and gods falls on Odysseus for being so careless as to attack the son of a god. From another point of view, Poseidon is to blame for taking such harsh action against Odysseus for simply defending himself. Now Athena gets involved, determined to help Odysseus towards his homecoming, in defiance of Poseidon's wrath. Such is the multifaceted nature of conflict between humans and the gods throughout the Odyssey. At the beginning of Odysseus' tale, he is found trapped on the island of Calypso, Ogygia, where he has been held captive by her for 8 years. He blames Calypso for holding him there, though he has been sleeping with her and making no effort to leave. It is not until Hermes is given the task by Zeus to send word to Calypso to free Odysseus, who builds a raft out of trees on the island, a task that could have been completed very shortly after his arrival, that he leaves his place of captivity. Zeus himself, after speaking with Athena, is even convinced that it is by Calypso's harshness alone that Odysseus is trapped. It is also worth noting that Proteus, the old man of the sea, believes as well that Odysseus is being held completely against his will when he tells Telemachus, "That was Odysseus, son of Laertes, who makes his home in Ithaca, whom I saw on an island weeping big tears in the palace of the nymph Calypso, and she detains him by constraint, and he cannot make his way to his country." This illustrates the widespread human belief that humans are without fault, and the gods, who were responsible for Odysseus' release from Calypso and to an extent his return home, are to blame for the shortcomings and tragedies of humans, who disregard their own role in the godly penalties they are faced with, as is the case with Odysseus and his bedmate Calypso. Calypso's island of Ogygia is but the first of many instances along Odysseus' path toward home that questionable blame can be seen throughout the story. Chronologically, Odysseus' time with Calypso is near the close of his journey. The debatable tales of his travels begin with the Lotus Eaters, shortly after Odysseus and his crew are bombarded by storms for 3 days, following their ransacking of Ismaros and their retreat after the arrival of reinforcements of Caconians. The Lotus Eaters, while unaffiliated with any god in particular, are a source of debatable blame as well. While the lotus flowers are undoubtedly imbued with some sort of magic capable of strong persuasion and enticement, it is worth questioning the resolve of men to overcome this persuasive power to return to their companions and their eventual homecoming. As Odysseus states in his tale of the Phaeacians, "I myself took these men weeping by force to where the ships were, and put them aboard under the rowing benches and tied them fast. But could these men have been under more enchantment of their own, choosing vehemently to stay where they believed they would be happier than at home in Ithaca?" After fleeing the island of the Lotus Eaters, Odysseus and his crew arrive in the land of the Cyclopes, who, putting all their trust in the immortal gods, neither plow with their hands nor plant anything, but all grows for them without seed planting, without cultivation, and it is Zeus' rain that waters it for them. When considering the life of the Cyclopes, which is unconcerned with the wrath of the gods, why would the gods choose to provide such natural abundance to the Cyclopes, with the exception of Polyphemus, son of Poseidon? Polyphemus himself states, The Cyclopes do not concern themselves with Zeus of the Aegis, nor any of the rest of the blessed gods, since we are far better than they. Why would the son of a god himself choose to so outwardly besmirch their name, especially when such prosperity has been placed upon them? Upon entering the cave of Polyphemus with his 12 best men, Odysseus' statements of peace are met with the gruesome devouring of 2 of his men by Polyphemus. Through means of trickery and intoxication, Odysseus and his men manage to blind Polyphemus, son of Poseidon, in his sleep, and escape, losing several other men to Polyphemus' mouth in the meantime. Odysseus also chooses to taunt Polyphemus from his ship once distance has been placed between them, to which Polyphemus responds with thrown stones that nearly beach the smug Odysseus and his crew once again. Thus begins the wrath of Poseidon against Odysseus for the violence and mockery against his son. Next, Odysseus and his crew arrive in the land of Iollos, who not only spoils them for a month with entertainment and open ears for storytelling, but also gives Odysseus the bag of winds placed under his watch by Zeus. In an unfortunate turn of events, Odysseus' own men selfishly caused their own delay of homecoming by foolishly opening the bag of winds while Odysseus slept, thinking it contained riches given by Iollos that Odysseus was hoarding for his homecoming while his men received nothing. This adds an extra source of blame in the long-hindered homecoming of Odysseus, as well as the element of treachery. The winds push Odysseus and his crew back to the land of Iollos, where they return to his home to beg for further aid, but are instead met with harsh words of banishment. For Iollos exclaims, "I have no right to see on his way, none to give passage to any man whom the blessed gods hate with such bitterness. Out. This arrival means you are hateful to the immortals." This is a prime example of an intricate web of blame, where Odysseus' men blame him for their misfortune, he blames them for their treachery, and Iollos blames all of them for their own hardship, believing they must have angered the gods and been hateful towards them. Could this simply be an exchange of uncertainty and fear between mortal men, or are the gods to blame for allowing such a disastrous turn of events? Odysseus and his crew then depart heavy-hearted, and after arriving 7 days later to the land of the giant Lystragones, are quickly driven out when the king and queen order death to the intruders of their homeland. Odysseus and the men on his ship alone are the only ones to escape the wrath of the Lystragonians, who hurl rocks and spears down upon them from the cliffs between which the men's ships were docked. With no particular gods mentioned during this part of the poem, where is blame to be placed? Is it with Odysseus and his men for not being more cautious with their advances into unknown land, or with Artache, daughter of the Lystragonian king Antiphates, who pointed them toward the palace where their destruction was devised? Did Artache know her father and mother would demand their deaths, deceiving them into entrapment, or did she simply want to help Odysseus and his men but chose the wrong method? After narrowly escaping the land of the Lystragonians, Odysseus and the remains of his crew came to the land of Aiaia, home of the goddess Circe, who turned his men into pigs with potions and magic under the guise of kindness. Only with the help of Hermes and his antidote did Odysseus manage to confront Circe and resist her magic, or so it may seem. Could it be that Odysseus possessed a unique nature, human or greater, that allowed him to repel her enchantment? Or did he simply learn the nature and ability of the antidote and, with this knowledge, single-handedly maintain his integrity? Regardless of the means, Odysseus' actions swayed Circe to allow all of them to return to human form and spend a year feasting and being merry, while Odysseus bedded with her for the entirety of their stay, rather enthusiastically, as shown when he abruptly states, "So I spoke, and she at once swore me the oath, as I asked her. But after she had sworn me the oath and made an end of it, I mounted the surpassingly beautiful bed of Circe." Between his sexual encounters with Circe now and Calypso later on, it bears asking whether the blame for Odysseus' delayed homecoming falls with him. Not only is he delaying many years of action to stay with the goddess and nymph respectively, but he enthusiastically sleeps with them and breaks his bond with Penelope in her absence. The gods themselves are not always known for their faithfulness to one another, but how do they view adultery in mortals? Could the gods be creating more hardship for Odysseus in response to his defiling his own marriage? After leaving Aiaia and the bed of Circe, Odysseus is tasked by Circe to make the terrifying journey to Hades to speak with the soul of Tiresias the Theban, a prophet who can help him prepare for the coming trials he faces. Upon arriving in Hades, Odysseus not only speaks with his mother, Anticlea, wife of Laertes, but with several souls who had all bedded with gods and goddesses, hinting at the idea that adultery with the immortals may be frowned upon. Tiresias also instructs Odysseus to pay homage to Poseidon in a land far from the sea before dying a peaceful death, leading the reader to assume that the gods have direct control over the fates of mortals and expect devout worship in exchange for a pardon of wrongs. After leaving Hades, Odysseus and his crew confront the Sirens, who Odysseus manages to conquer by having his men tie him up while they plug their ears in order to avoid the siren song. They then come to the passage of Scylla and Charybdis, where Odysseus loses 6 men, 1 to each head of Scylla, while narrowly avoiding the vortex created by Charybdis. Here, blame could be placed on Scylla for hungrily and menacingly snatching the men, or on Odysseus for allowing these men to be sacrificed for the sake of his homecoming. After escaping the reach of Scylla and Charybdis, Odysseus and his crew arrive in the land of Helios, the sun god, whose cattle Odysseus was instructed by Tiresias to leave alone. Once again, evil befalls Odysseus as he is drifted to sleep, and led by Eurylochus, his men choose to betray him by eating the cattle of Helios against his warning, stating they would rather die out at sea by the god's wrath than starve to death on his island. As prophesied, their ship is struck down at sea, leaving only Odysseus to paddle using fragments of the ship for 10 days before reaching Ogygia, where the story becomes current. The question becomes why Odysseus deserves to be punished for the mutiny of his men. After telling his story to the Phaeacians, they convey him finally back to his homeland where the suitors are courting his lovely wife Penelope. Under the guise given to him by Athena, and with the help of his loyal herdsmen, maids, and his son Telemachus, he slaughters the suitors and reclaims his homestead, yet is stayed by Athena and Zeus to kill their angered families as well. The final question to be asked is whether Odysseus is to blame for the suitors' ransacking of his home, his wine, his cattle, and his belongings, due to his own lack of effort at times in returning home from his journey. Staying with Circe for 1 year and Calypso for 8 clearly shows his reluctance to return home, as much as he claims to miss Penelope. With this in mind, where does the blame truly fall throughout the story for all of Odysseus' misfortunes? Is it with the suitors, who constantly plague his mind with the thought that his wife is being tormented in his own home while he is absent? Or are they within their bounds to court a grieving, vulnerable woman whose husband has been long lost and to defend themselves against his wrathful and also grieving son? Is it with the gods, who perpetually delay his return with divine interventions? Or are they simply guarding that which is theirs, such as in the cases of Poseidon and Helios? Or is the fault with Odysseus alone, for taking irresponsible liberties not inherent to a married man with obligations to his family, who instead chooses to squander away nearly a decade of his life to selfish merriment and lavishness? Perhaps the lesson Homer wants to teach with the Odyssey is simply to keep in mind at all times the consequences of one's actions and how they impact those around them, particularly those that love them most.
Thank you, Matthew. Comments or questions?
Not all at once.
Yes.
I wonder if we could sort of extend the theme of the last paper and the conversation afterwards into this one a little bit. And I want to add a word to I wanted to add a character to the last one. I want to add a word to your paper.
Okay.
Necessity. I wonder, we see Odysseus having to do all these things. And you raise, I think this is a really interesting point, right? That how captive is he when he's on the island, right? Everybody says he's captive, but then he gets out of it by his own art, right? He builds
Right.
it and he's out of there. But it seems like maybe we could read something like, the goddess has to be told to let him go, and then his art will work, or some strange thing. I'll let Professor Berger answer that.
I have a special room to the gods.
But anyways, I wonder, with an eye to your questions about the gods and their relation to human beings, does there seem to be a lesson about necessity that we could understand even in a world without gods that are interfering?
Maybe I'm misinterpreting the way you're asking, but I feel in regards to necessity, even with his extremely long gates of time with the nymph and with Calypso and with Circe, yes, thank you. With the two of them, I feel as though to escape from their captivity, one way or the other, I feel the adultery may have even been necessary in its own regard, just to keep them in good terms with him and allow him to leave unscathed. So I don't know if that answers your question or not, but that's how I interpreted it.
So I think the evidence that you point to that suggests that Odysseus could have left Calypso's island sooner that seems right. I mean, if he can build a raft in a few days, did he really need to be shown the grove? I mean, it's not that big an island.
Right.
So that sounds right to me. And this idea that he stays for a year with Circe, what's that about? In the text, it just disappears, right? There's just one line, and the year is gone. But I wonder if, again, kind of tying this to the earlier paper, one of the things that Professor Berger was said in the recognition scene was that, Penelope might know that Odysseus, the human being she was married to all that time ago, is sitting before her. But she still may not know if this is the Odysseus that she needs to take control and to give order to things. I wonder if Odysseus needs the journey in order to be the Odysseus that can be Odysseus at home.
Right.
We get a sense of that on Circe's island, where she says, your breast is hollow, stay and recover. I don't know what he might need from Calypso. I wonder, we know that the gods have forgotten him, so I wonder if he needs not just to get home, but he needs to be watched. Getting home, he needs the gods to see him. I don't know, but I guess that you could play this out with the different parts. But I just wonder what you think about this idea that, sure, Odysseus, the bag of bones, and could get home much quicker, but could the Odysseus that he needs to be get home any quicker than he did?
Right. I feel as though on one hand it might have been necessary for him to experience this very long journey to solidify his dedication to returning home and getting back to his family and his obligations as a leader. But on the other hand, I also see it as being nothing more than an overly drawn out, just sustenance of the flesh, just fulfilling his own just primal obligations and returning home even a changed man. It's hard to say whether or not he's even devoted to his nation when he returns anymore after experiencing all these different adulterous motives and just different experiences off from his homeland. So it's really hard for me to say whether or not he's become what he needs to be, or if he's even lost something of himself in the process. Yes.
So Machiavelli, when talking about Fortuna, that sort of that big category of stuff we can't control, stuff that just comes at us.
Right.
He describes, he offers two analogies: the rushing river and the sort of female figure, right? And in both cases, he suggests that these analogies help us to understand that these are forces that can be reckoned with and ought to be reckoned with, right? He gives no quarter to those who simply put their arms up and says, "Oh, Fortuna has masturbated." I wonder if to some extent Homer is suggesting the same thing, that these are forces that can be reckoned with, whether they're gods or necessity, or something that doesn't necessarily have to be defined in divine terms. These are forces that can be reckoned with, ought to be reckoned with, and might not be reckoned with, and that the failure to reckon with them is just sort of textbook unheroic behavior.
Yeah, I certainly feel as though Homer wrote it with a level of ambiguity. I think while he does recognize an extent to where things might just be out of one's hands, I think there's definitely a hint that humans have a lot more abilities than they give themselves credit for, or that they allow themselves the bravery to attempt to better themselves. So yeah, I would definitely say he leaves it open to interpretation whether or not the gods have overall control over the humans throughout the story, or whether it's just their own devices that help or hinder them. Yes.
First, I should say that our last questioner is Dr. Benjamin Leinert, who's a Montesquieu Forum postdoctoral fellow.
Oh.
He'll be with us for the next 2 years, including teaching classes for us, one of which next semester will be a course on the Beddoes papers.
Oh, wow.
Political science department and philosophy department. But I want to ask you a question about time in the Odyssey. I mean, it's a curious thing. If you go back to the course that we had, these things are based on, time figures so prominently in several of the works. The Odyssey is one, Shakespeare's Winter's Tale and the other. In a certain way, the Odyssey has an arc of 20 years. Yet 18 to 19 of the years are suppressed in interesting ways. And you have the 10 years of the war, and 1 year with Circe, and the 7 or so years with Calypso. And given your paper, they're clearly crucial in trying to interpret something about the relationship between the human and the divine. But in a certain way, from the perspective of the reader looking at the book, nothing happens. The year with Circe, like sleeping with her, but
Right.
from our perspective, nothing happens. And when he's with Calypso, we learn from the narrator, Homer, that she had pleased him for some length of time, but then when she stops pleasing him, he weeps and doesn't seem to be capable of escaping, even though once he does escape, in retrospect, it looks relatively easy. And so that 7-year period, we learn nothing about what happens, and there's all of this other business that we learn of when he's telling the story to the Phaeacians with the Laestrygonians and the Cyclopes and Scylla, fantastic stories, and they're all compressed into a very short time frame. He gets back to Ithaca. So much happens over the span of 5 books of the Odyssey in such a short period of time, and then he's going to go off someplace else to where they don't recognize him or as being an oar. I think it's a widower fan for separating weeds that are planted in the ground. So there seems to be some view of delay and a great deal of action going on. So let me put the question as simply as I can. Why all of this time that clearly has transpired in which we don't learn anything about what's taking place? Does that connect to your theme in any way?
I can certainly see. I mean, first I'll speak in reference to the island of Calypso. I feel as though maybe after all his different journeys and all the setbacks he's had to endure leading up to that point, I feel maybe his very long stint on the island might have been, once he decided he was unhappy and he was weeping on the shore, I feel as though maybe he just had a lapse in self-reliance or motivation to leave, and he was content with just staying where he was rather than getting back, just because he had been so what's the word I'm looking for? Just loss of confidence, I guess, would be, for lack of a better term at the moment. He just decides he's better off just staying where he is and remaining stagnant rather than putting forth the effort to begin his homecoming. As for the 20-year period overall, I would say Homer really isn't focusing as much on, in reference to blame, he certainly has hints one way or the other in the amount of time, but I think he leaves it more as a just to be considered at the end of the story, all things considered, to just take all factors into account and disregard the amount of time that's passed, to just consider his different actions and how they weigh his own blame against that of the gods and his crew, and just I think it's left up to interpretation of the reader at the end of the story, just to allocate blame one way or the other and draw their own assumptions, conclusions.
Other comments, questions before we get to Professor Pertner?
Maybe just concluding, very quick concluding. Just one little. Your conclusion was that we should take responsibility, is a kind of moral responsibility. Humans should. But that's an old teaching, and it's quite compatible with praising and blaming gods. It's the normal, actually maybe even more compatible for ordinary people who believe in, I don't know about, in a way blaming God, praying, do something for me. It's an implicit blame.
Yeah.
So that doesn't seem necessary. So you think Homer, it doesn't seem necessary to avoid blaming gods in order to, in a certain way, in order to take responsibility in this moral sense.
Yeah.
You think Homer sees it differently though? He's trying to separate these things.
I think that he allows enough leeway for humans to blame the gods, but considering the gods can't, I mean, at least by our own perspective, they can't be conversed with. They can't be asked what they think their blame is. I think it's left for the humans to either remove the blame from themselves and avoid the consequences of their actions by putting the blame on the gods, or to take full responsibility and keep in mind for future actions what the consequences may be.
You know, there's a god of blame in the Republic, Momo. There's a god just that blames everything that the gods do.
Just the scapegoat. Yeah, scapegoat god, right.
It's interesting that since the NFL draft is going to be here, it's worth saying that when you get football players being interviewed after the game, they never blame God for dropping they thank God for the touchdown that one of them managed to score.
Right.
There's actually an Onion article that does poke fun at that, saying one of the players does blame God, and it's a very funny read.
That's interesting.
Well, I think perhaps it's time to turn to Professor Berger's comments.
Okay, I think you honed in on the most important central theme of the Odyssey, and maybe certainly all epics, and I would say of the Bible, and of a lot of important works. You inspired me to look back at the beginning. It's kind of weird and interesting how this issue comes up right in the first, few lines of the Odyssey. And it's odd. I mean, I don't have an interpretation really. The theme of humans trying to shirk responsibility by blaming the gods, putting all the blame on the gods, that's in the mouth of Zeus, which is understandable. They blame us for everything. But it's also weird that his example is Aegisthus. No example from the Odyssey out of the mouth of Zeus at that point. And then the first thing that's said, which is also kind of striking when you think back, is about the example of humans' recklessness being responsible for all their problems, is the cavil of Helios, the sun god. Why that particular case, right? You did such a nice job of going through the whole sequence of adventures, and I like the way you asked very naturally, and perhaps it is, I think it is, you could go even more deeply into each one. Well, case by case, right? What can we blame this situation on? The sun god certainly is blamable on the companions most obviously, but weird that it hones in on that point, right? That step in the adventure, and it is the last point before Odysseus is on his own. It's the only thing that somehow strikes me as a starting point for thinking that through. But in any case, on the big theme, here's what I would say. I think you really need 3 planes, 3 levels at work. And that would be the divine intervention, and of course it's, I think you had a beautiful formula, the intricate web of blame, with polytheism, right, with many gods. The gods are at odds. Their plans don't jive, right? There's Poseidon, Athena, and Zeus, so that's all got to be untangled. And then of course we do see human choice at work, right? So your theme is correct. But there's also another thing which Homer calls fate. And it's maybe indistinguishable from necessity or fortuna, perhaps, but it's fate, right? And he's far from neglecting that. So I think the whole poem and each adventure you've got to constantly look at the interaction of these three planes. And when one of them dominates, the others fade in some way. So I would say the island of with Calypso, we really aren't given any information about either divine intervention or human choice, and therefore you're drawn to say there's something fated about this empty space of time, and I'm not precluding, I think you're absolutely right, that Odysseus is now in a position to reflect on everything he's gone through in this rapid sequence. That must be important, we can assume, for his homecoming and what he learns about himself. But now my teacher, Seth Benedetti, wrote a very rich book on the Odyssey called The Bow and the Lyre. And I love the way, he has a comment in the beginning that I think is really fruitful, and especially because he looks at both the Iliad and the Odyssey here. And it's weird. I forgot about this. I think maybe someone mentioned it. In book 2 of the Odyssey already, you hear from the seer, Therses. He's talking to the suitors and warning them, you guys are in trouble, something's about to happen, there's some impending doom. And he says, I foretold this 20 years ago, that 20 years would go by before Odysseus would have a homecoming and then the suitors would be destroyed. So in a way, the whole plot, it's already written, right? It's been inscribed and sealed before the Trojan War. So that's a kind of a challenge for a poet.
Yeah.
That's not a very interesting story, right? If it's all just necessity from the start. So that's the horizon or the framework. Within that within that fate, how are the gods trying to implement their plans, and what are they up to? And how are human beings making their choices? So Benedetti, here's what I thought was really subtle and interesting about his observation. It's actually true in the Iliad as well as in the Odyssey that fate has already determined. Achilles already has a fate or destiny, as does Odysseus. And yet, in a way, the pivot of each poem is a choice. This is his reading, but I certainly, I can't even think apart from it. It seems so powerful reading. That Odysseus makes his choice not to stay with Calypso and become immortal, which in and of itself is, interesting. You don't really choose mortality, do you? But yet the poet has him choosing mortality as a choice. And Achilles chooses to die young at Troy and be a hero and not go home and live a long and quiet life. So the way Benedetti puts it is, how does each hero put on his fate? Right? There's a sort of putting on of the fate of the individual. And then he makes this, in a way, the most subtle observation. In the Iliad, you learn from the events of the poem how Achilles came to put on his fate. In the Odyssey, and here's the difference, you learn through the perspective of Odysseus himself how he came to choose his fate, or put on his fate, through this way in which he tells the stories of his adventures and what he learned from them. I think that's, very interesting.
Absolutely.
And maybe I should stop.
Let me ask a question just to pull a little bit more out. If you take a look at the 2 episodes in which Odysseus is waylaid and we don't find out what happens, the one with Calypso and then the one with Circe. In the case of Calypso, in order to leave the island, Hermes first has to come. He's sent by Zeus because Athena has spoken to Zeus. In the case of Circe, it's Odysseus's men who go to him and say, you seem to be having a wonderful time, but we've spent a year here doing nothing. So you have this marvelous contrast between action in the poem being initiated by the gods on the one hand, and the action being initiated by human beings on the other. Do you have any thoughts about that? Do you think this is a telling difference, or what do you think it shows anything?
I almost feel like it shows a little bit of lack of action on Odysseus' part, whether it be for his own selfish gains of staying and being merry with Circe and with Calypso. The fact that he had to be helped out of Calypso's island by Zeus and Athena, and he had to be told by his crew to leave Circe's island. I don't know, I can't say for sure whether it's by his own choice or if he's just unable to overcome his more primal instincts to remain and eat lavishly and procreate and So yeah, I would say from another blame perspective, it's certainly within reason to blame Odysseus for those particular events.
Especially the Circe story. And that is striking that the other guys say, remember what we're supposed to be doing.
And it's interesting because it's a reverse of the Lotus Eaters Island. Because on the Lotus Eaters, it's the crew that's distracted and Odysseus too. So it's human. I get the reversal. Circe versus. And one other thing, and this has been, since we're leaving the Odyssey behind now, right? We're moving to the Apology, is that right?
We will be making a journey.
Right.
Away from the Odyssey to the Apology.
Because both papers on the Odyssey, so this is to you, but I guess it has to be to you. You
I'll leave it to you as well.
It is to you, Alena. There, I'm talking about right. So it's to both of you, because you both talked about the sexual morality, and I just wonder if within Homer you see any suggestion from any character, divine or human, that Odysseus is sleeping around is immoral.
No.
I don't see any, like zero. That seems like a completely external.
The one example I would see is with all the different souls in Hades that had slept with gods and goddesses that end up in Hades, but I think that's...
We all end up in Hades.
Fair, very fair.
Not Menelaus.
But yeah, with particular regard to those that had adulterated with the gods and goddesses, I think that's really the only indication that adultery is frowned upon, is when it's crossing into the immortal realm by mortals.
Although, one interesting thing that connects, I think, all these things, because you were also talking about Penelope putting up with all this stuff, when Telemachus tells Penelope what he's learned on his trip, he says he was absolutely compelled and constrained by this goddess. So part of the argument we get for the compulsion comes from Telemachus trying to protect his mother from the sad news that her husband she's pining for has been sleeping with a goddess for all these years. So,
Let me ask both Alena and Matthew, at this point I think dovetails on both of your papers. So there is a lot of sex that's going on in the Odyssey, but it doesn't involve Odysseus. It involves the suitors and it involves the maids.
you mean in Ithaca?
In
In Ithaca, yeah, right?
You said in the Odyssey.
In the Odyssey.
But in
In home.
Yeah.
No, but what about
Odysseus?
Odysseus' goddess?
No,
You mean like clearly written?
I mean, clearly articulated. So you don't see, and I thought this was part of the point, Ron, you don't see in the case of Odysseus that he's involved with any human being.
Oh.
There's just Calypso and Circe, and that seems to be something unique, and I thought that was part of the point.
There's a little flirtation with Nausicaa.
Yes, there is, and that's a separate story. We don't have a paper on it.
They divided the women of the Ciconians equally among them. There's Odysseus not here.
Yeah, so there's that, and there's the suitors and the maidens, and that has this problematic character, and the maidens are going along with this. So it seems to me, maybe I've already decided that next time I teach the Odyssey, I'm asking the question of your paper about how we're going to understand Penelope and try to put it the way in which you put it in your paper. But it also occurs to me that there's a topic to be thought about, just the role of human sexuality in the Odyssey. But with the Cacones and Nausicaa and the goddesses, I mean, in a certain way, Charles Common suggested to me, maybe it's all over the place in a certain respect.
I mean, in regards to sexuality, it almost takes an equal stance with, I mean, at least in my mind, it takes an equal level of importance and level of influence with the gods and goddesses themselves of determining how humans, how they organize their actions. I mean, it's almost conflicting whether or not they'll go by the will of the gods or the will of their own primacy at times. I mean, with particular reference to Odysseus, the one thought that crossed my mind is maybe with Penelope being held at such high, like almost divine regard, that perhaps he only chooses to sleep with gods to either to fill the void that he's been missing by not returning home by his device or what have you, but to fill the void of not having Penelope, he chooses to sleep with the goddesses, or with Calypso and with Circe respectively, to maybe both to fulfill those primal urges and to fill that void that Penelope no longer fills as a near or perceived to be near divine being. So.
Final comment.
No,
Oh,
just-
sorry.
go
Let's
ahead.
get to
Go
go.
ahead.
Andy, no. Oh, absolutely. Yes, please.
I've just been thinking of this question throughout this whole discussion, and I'm wondering what both of you think about if we do use this idea of fate when we're discussing Homer and the idea of like tempting forces, and then we employ it over the storyline, especially over yours, where your question being who has the blame. Does this leave Circe or Calypso with any agency at all, or are they simply forces that are tempting? And also, does this leave agency at all to anyone who's making those choices within the Odyssey? I mean, does it suggest that fate exists in these bubbles between choices, or that choices are fate? And I think most interesting of all, where does this leave Penelope in terms of agency? Because although she isn't a force that is like constantly tempting men or fate or whatever, she is a home to and to come home to, and without that, the Odyssey wouldn't exist. So where does agency really lie if we do employ this idea of fate?
I feel as though, like you said, fate it's almost found only in transition in between major events. I feel like the most major events, blame can be placed almost entirely either on divine intervention or human fault. As for with Penelope, I think going back to your paper, I feel like she's well within her bounds to manipulate the social forces around her rather than trying to take more forward and abrasive action. I feel as though she was very wise to just utilize the social structures around her rather than take the risk of like taking a more conspicuous action. But I mean, overall, in regards to fate, I feel like it's hard to say, but for a majority of the time, I feel as though either humans or the gods and their respective faults are majority to blame.
Can I add one little quick? In that first speech by Zeus in the beginning, human beings, he specifically says, blame us for things that were due to their own recklessness beyond fate. So there's a kind of constraint there within which both gods and humans.
The Odyssey is an extraordinary book.